Welcome to the Deeper by Design podcast, where faith meets the science and practice of connection. I'm Dr. Trevor Hislop, author, speaker, marriage and family therapist, and ministry leader. So here's the premise. Everything is relational. We were designed by God for deep relationships, but deep connection doesn't just happen. It's something we can design through intentional practice, one moment at a time. That's why this podcast brings together theology that forms us and relational science that explains us, so we can move from inspiration to transformation. In this podcast, you'll hear practical teaching, tools, and stories that can help you build emotional safety, interrupt destructive cycles, and practice repair that restores trust. In some episodes, it's me offering clear frameworks and simple steps that you can use right away. In other episodes, I'm joined by innovative thought leaders at the intersection of theology, psychology, neuroscience, and leadership. I'm so glad you're here. Let's go deeper by design. Hey, and welcome to another episode of the Deeper by Design podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Hislop, and I am honored to have with me today a special guest. This is Jason VanRuler. Jason, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we have a lot of overlaps with schools we've attended, cities we've lived in, and so I'm excited to talk about that. But I just want to share a little bit about Jason's background. He's a licensed therapist, an author, a coach, a speaker who helps people heal what is holding them back so they can lead, so they can love, and really so they can live with greater integrity. Jason's work brings together psychology, faith, and practical tools for lasting change. So through therapy, intensive speaking engagements, organizational work, he helps individuals, couples, leaders, and teams recognize the patterns that surface under the pressure and develop healthier, more honest ways of relating. So he's the author of Get Past Your Past, How Facing Your Broken Places Leads to True Connection. And then his newest book, which is Discovering Your Communication Style, the 5 Paths of Deeper Connection and Stronger Relationships. So in this new book, Jason introduces the Paths Communication Framework, which we're going to talk about more in depth in our episode. And this helps people understand not only how they communicate, but the deeper motivations and the needs that shape their work, their worlds, their reactions, and ultimately their relational patterns. And so, Jason, I am so honored to have you on this podcast. So thank you for joining me here today. Jason and I, just before we started this recording, I mentioned to him he's like the perfect guest for this podcast because, again, for those of you, again, who've been following and listening to this podcast, you know that the whole thing is about this idea of integrating faith with science and practice of connection. And Jason has spent years doing this work, so I'm really excited to hear his insights today. And Jason, before we get to that, I'm just really curious if maybe just share a little bit about you. I'd love our listeners to hear a little bit about maybe part of your story and what ultimately drew you to the kind of work that you do today.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Been looking forward to this episode. So this is fantastic to spend some time with you today. I think, when I talk about my story, I wanted to be a therapist at a young age. So I always joke with people that I had a journal at age 8, and I literally wrote in the journal I wanted to be. At that time, I wrote a psychologist. I wanted to write books. I wanted to live in a brownstone apartment. I had some pretty specific desires as an 8-year-old, and I still had the journal. And so what that tells me is if you're 8 years old and journaling, you're probably on your way, right? I mean, that's
a good start right there.
You're working your way towards that. And I think I already dressed like a therapist. So I had ruled out, the NBA or NFL. And
well, sure.
I was like, okay, this is probably going to be for me. And, life took some different directions. And so it took me a while to kind of get to the place where I was ready to really answer that call. But then I did. And so loved that, got to go to, what we've talked about, got to go to the seminary and go to school there for a master's in counseling and work through that and then develop a private practice. And so over the course of my career, have just gotten to work in a lot of different rooms. I started early on working in the prison system and Department of Corrections. And so that was something and taught me a lot. And I worked at hospitals and doing interventions and recovery and addiction. And so what's been really good is just all these different opportunities to see people in really all walks of life and to see that we all struggle we all have wounds, and we're all seeking connection. And so that's been a big
Mm.
driver of my career, is just this idea of how do we do that better? And then also, as a guy who's been married a while and got 3 kids, it matters a lot to me personally, right? I look at my family and I go, how do I do this well? So that's driven a lot of my curiosity for what are the things maybe we didn't get taught that we should have been or could have been that would have made this easier.
Yeah. Yeah. That's sorry. I love sharing that. Like, there's meaning to you in your story, right? And I don't know any 8-year-old that even knows what a psychologist is, let alone aspire to be one. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think my
that you,
parents were like, this kid's going to need to save money for school. This is going to be expensive. This is going to cost.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, when I was 8, I was like out, kicking a soccer ball or, or attempting, to play some other sport, and far from my mind. But I think what I love about that is there's story there, this idea of this early sense of calling, this early sense of meaning. I mean, this whole kind of idea of like, hey, you had this early sort of like, hey, I want to help people. Right. It's not just that I want to dress a certain way or I want to go to school for a long time, or right, that this deeper, kind of sense in you of wanting to serve and care for others.
Yeah.
So we've kind of referenced a little bit. So I know you're practicing, living, raising your family in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Now I don't know many people who have lived in South Dakota, except for I know that you are currently there and have been there for a long time. I would say the joy. I've actually lived there twice. I went to school there. I also attended the same, of course, university you did, and then came back and spent some years serving a local church there. And so fun to be able to. In fact, you and I had a couple months ago had a chance to be in person together and just swap stories about that community. And it's so what a great way that community is, I think, been important in both of our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't meet someone from South Dakota every day, but we do exist. There are people here, as you know. You
That's
sometimes
right.
have to explain that to people, but it's a great place to be from and raise a family.
Yeah, that's good. So as we kind of get into it, one of and I've shared this with my listeners many times, one of the central kind of themes and ideas, the premises really of my work, is that everything is relational. Every interaction, every trauma, every thought, every experience, somewhere deep down inside, every hurt, every wound, somewhere there's this relational aspect to it. And so today, as we want to really get into the idea of communication, communication is often where the inner world becomes visible to the outer world, right? This idea of our relationships. And so sometimes in healthy ways, and as we know, sometimes through some unhealthy, right, some patterned ways that maybe we don't fully understand. And so I really want to talk about communication and kind of just dig into that deeper. And maybe want to start with this, like, communication is more than just words. And I say that because I have many couples that have come into my office, and I'm sure you've had couples and families or work teams in the space you work, right, where they just say, hey, we just need to communicate better. When you say, like, what's the presenting problem, or why are you here? Right. And they think there's some magical wand that we can, shake. And if we could just give them better words, then everything would be fine. Right. So as I kind of maybe set up a question for you here, like, I think when most people hear the word communication, they tend to think primarily about talking clearly or maybe choosing the right words. But really in your work, as I've read it and followed you, your work suggests that something much deeper is happening. So can you maybe it might be a place to just start, like, just tell us, what is communication?
Yeah. Well, and that's a good lead up. I think just like you, I meet with couples and teams, and that is often the presenting problem. And yet what's fascinating about that is when you ask someone to kind of dig in, so what about communication? Usually the response is, well, we just can't do it. We just can't communicate. And
right. It's either we can or we can't. It's
yeah, and
yes
it's
or
like,
no.
well, what does that mean? And they're like, I don't know, we just can't, and
Right.
so it's this thing that I think feels pretty abstract at times. And, I'm a simple guy, and I tend to look at things probably pretty simply, but I think communication, really, at the heart of it it's just an exchange of information between two people for the purpose of connection. And that exchange is both what we say, how we look, how we listen,
Yeah.
so it's not just about the words. I think sometimes, like you said, the hope would be if I could learn how to speak more clearly or better, that's actually going to be the solution here. And
Yeah.
what I found is that, hey, there's nothing wrong with that, right? It doesn't hurt you, but it's just a lot deeper than that. And so that was the point of the book, is how do we really dig into what it's actually about, not just what we think it's about.
Hmm. Yeah. That's good. In fact, I've heard this before, and you probably have too. It's the statement, it's not really about what it's about,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Like
great.
the whatever is presenting on the surface, like that's not it, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think, so I'm hearing you talk about this, that there, clearly there is something more, there is something deeper, right? So maybe just lead off of that. Maybe share a little bit, like maybe how does our own personal history, our personality, our fears, our needs, expectations, all of those things, how do they, before we get to talk about the actual framework and styles, but how do those things shape the way we communicate?
Yeah, well, we're always collecting information. And so, that starts right away. And we collect information from our families. And as it
Yes.
relates to communication, we're incentivized to say some things and not to say others. And we
Yeah.
get
Right.
reactions we appreciate from some things and not from others. And so over time, what happens is we often adapt our communication to fit well into the environment we're growing up in, because if we don't,
Yeah.
it's really difficult. And so
Right.
what most people do is they go, well, let me kind of assess the rules of the system. Let me assess how the family communicates. And then what do I say to fit in with that?
Mm.
And that works for a time. I mean, there can be challenges, but where the struggle often comes is then when we exit our family and we go into adulthood, and we go, okay, well, now you've got a family and they've got a family. And so how do we all show up with our own experience and history, but also knowing now the environment and context has changed?
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. I'm gonna made me think of, like, in a lot of the work that I do in like relational space, or getting, I work with a lot of couples, families. I work with a lot of teams as well. Um, uh, I often share and I often teach about the idea of our relational cycles.
Mm.
And just to maybe just share a little bit about that. And it's the simple kind of progression, but it becomes secular, right? That's why we call these kind of these cycles or these patterns, right? So let me just kind of play this out for you. And I have a kind of a question of how communication shows up in this. So, there's some kind of event, right? Or some kind of situation that happens. Usually there's some kind of trigger. Trigger is like, there's tone, there's inflection, there's intensity, there's body language. There's something that we're kind of like reading, right? In the midst of some kind of relational interaction. And then in the midst of that, we end up what I call an instant story. The instant story is the quick assumption, or the quick kind of interpretation that we gave to, again, whatever that kind of cue was, or that trigger was, right? And then if we follow that cycle, then it usually leads to some kind of emotional reaction, and then it usually leads to some kind of protective response, and then it usually, it kind of plays itself out, and as I mentioned, it becomes secular. But I'm really curious about, in this case, the part of this kind of this, what I call, like, an instant story, which is the meaning that we assign to the interaction before we have time to slow down and really sort of examine it.
Mhm.
So what I'm curious about is, where do you see interpretation? Where do you see assumptions affecting the way people communicate?
Yeah, all over the place. I like that instant story, by the way. That's great. I like that. It's because it is. We kind of have this if then framework,
Right.
right? So we're
Yeah.
just sort of like,
Yeah.
well, if they say this, then it means that. And
Yeah.
I early on in my career, I did some training, and I'm a Midwest guy, obviously, and so I trained in New York, and boy, was that exciting, to get to the big city and be around
Yeah.
big city people, and so I met a person who was in my cohort, and they were from New York, just born and raised,
Mhm.
and they
Yeah.
spoke like a New Yorker. And so what they would do is they would speak like a New Yorker, and
Right.
and that to me honestly was really abrasive and hurtful. I
Mm.
struggled initially because my if then statement was, if
Yep.
someone interrupts you and they're brash, or they're loud, or they're kind of pushy, then they don't like you. They don't
Yeah.
like you. And so what I ended up doing is talk to the person. We were all therapists, so of course we're going to talk about everything forever. So I just sort of said, hey, this is hitting me funny. And he said, like, oh, that's not what I mean at all. I like you. You're a friend. This is just how I talk. And I said, oh, that's not what I mean at all. I like you. I'm your friend. And
Yeah.
so to answer your question, I think what happens is we bring our baggage and our wounds into the
Mm,
story, and we're
yeah.
always trying to get to the end quick. And so we go, I'm going to save time, and our brain's trying to help us save time. And so it's likely that if they said this, that's what they mean. The
Yeah.
challenge is not always, not always. And
Right.
so we
Right.
have to be open to the idea that it could be different.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of this seems now for those, whether providers, some, therapists who are listening in, or people who have had study in this area, it sounds very sort of CBT-ish, in a sense of kind of reframing and, or EFT and kind of, capturing what's the emotion underneath it. But there is these just kind of universal human kind of parts of this, right? Again, this like rushing in, assigning meaning to it, again, jumping to a conclusion, making an assumption. And then I'd imagine, I know this is true for me, right? Then it's not just that I jump to conclusion and make an assumption, but as I mentioned in the cycle, right? Then there's some emotion that's attached to it, and then there's some kind of behavior that follows, right? So that story of that, that co-therapist, right, who's just being a New Yorker, right? Like, I imagine for you initially, right, there's kind of, or I might be, if I imagine myself, right, I might be a little bit like, maybe he's not safe, maybe he doesn't like me, maybe I need to defend myself, or maybe I need to shut down, maybe I need to stay quiet, maybe I need to, right? And so the way that it would, again, impact the way that we interact with others. Yeah.
And then the danger is we make it true, right? So we then try to prove it, so we kind of have this faulty, to use your language, instant story. And then we go, how do I collect evidence to prove that?
Yeah.
And,
Like that.
how do I, be open to the idea that it's different? And I think what it really gets at is that on the deepest level, we all just want to be loved, seen, heard, connected, and so anything that risks or jeopardizes that gives us some sort of activation internally.
Yeah. It's good. Okay, so I would love to just spend some time, but just walking through, and if you could just give us like maybe a broad introduction to the paths framework, the 5 communication types, and then maybe just walk us through like what does each type bring to our relationships, to our conversations.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So, kind of like you in my work with people and communication, what I saw over and over again is, there's some predictability to this. I'm noticing some patterns, some themes. And so that really drove me to identify, what if this was easier? One of my struggles when I was trying to get better at communication and kind of working with people is that sometimes they would say, you know what, this is how you get good at communication. In conflict, just remember this 30 pages of information and you'll be good at it. And I was like,
sure, if it was only that simple.
Yeah, like, I don't think I can remember 3 paragraphs. So I was looking at it, just thinking like, how could this be made practical and useful? And so what I noticed are really 5 predictable ways that people show up in communication. And so it's paths, PATHS. And when we think about paths, the reason I named it that is, number 1, I made for a great acronym. So that was important. But number 2, I want to just remind people, we're just all on different paths to get to the same place. And I think that in and of itself is a really important lesson for a lot of people, because I think, like, kind of even when we were talking about the New Yorker thing, we sometimes make up a story that other people don't want what we want. That other people somehow, they don't want to be connected, they don't want to be loved, they don't want to feel heard. And that's just not true. And so I wanted to remind people with the acronym, hey, we're doing this together, just different. And so each one has strengths and opportunities for growth. I always say no one is better than others, but I am a harbor just like you. So you and I can agree harbors are the best. But I mean, for everybody else's sake, there's no one better than the other, right?
That's right. If I could just pause you for a second. When Jason and I were in person together a couple months ago, the book had recently had come out. He was kind enough to give me a copy. I think I went back to my room that night and like read like half the book, and the next day finished the book. And I remember coming back up to him and just like, Jason, I felt like I had to like check in with you, like somehow, like, and so I shared with you that I'm a harbor, which I know you're going to go on to explain each of these styles. Interesting to hear that you're the same. And again, we said maybe not surprising.
Yeah. I think in our line of work, it probably is useful, but we could be all different types. So So yeah, just starting with the P is the peacemaker. And really each of these types is about what the outcome is they want. So a peacemaker is just like it sounds. They're people who communicate for the sake of establishing and maintaining peace.
Hmm.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful thing. We need people who want peace. The challenge with that at times, though, is not every situation is set up for peace, nor does it require peace. Sometimes there are
Hmm.
difficult conversations we need to have. And so, even though that peacemaker helps kind of smooth out the rough edges and helps people get along and kind of communicates for the sake of all being pointed in the same direction, what's true is if they're not careful, sometimes they brush over some things that probably didn't give them peace that they actually needed to discuss.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes me think of, in my work, particularly with couples, the one member of the spouse said, self-identified as the peacekeeper,
Mm-hmm.
and the other, sees them not as that. They see them as conflict avoidant. Like,
Yes.
how do those two things interact?
I think they're both true. I think they're both true because
Sure.
depending on your communication type, that might come across to you as conflict avoidant. I think the reality is just that's the exact problem communication presents us with is perspective. And
Yeah.
and so from that peacemaker's perspective, it's like, well, I'm doing this to be helpful. I'm doing this for the greater good.
Yeah.
However, I think if you're one of the other types, particularly like an advocate who wants to speak out about what's fair and right and just, they might say, "Hey, you're avoiding talking about the thing I most want to talk about. Let's
Yeah.
get into it."
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Let me ask this, and maybe you can use this format for each of these. So what might a peacemaker need to practice in order to maybe communicate more honestly? So I think
Yeah,
maybe it was one of the tendencies with the peacemakers. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to cause any tension or any conflict. And so maybe there's, again, this propensity so I'll stay quiet or I'll share minimally. And so I think this question of is, again, if you're a peacemaker and you're listening to this, what's a practice that could help them to communicate more honestly?
yeah. I think for a peacemaker and really all of them, a lot of the task is just expanding your definition of what the thing is. So, like for a
Hmm.
peacemaker, expand the definition of what it means to be a peace.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so if my definition of what it is to be a piece is that I have to feel a certain way,
Yeah.
that's probably not going to help me have those difficult conversations because they're on the other side of maybe some discomfort.
Yeah.
And so you might redefine peace as being, did I, maintain my morals, my values? Was I kind? Did I give the other person an opportunity to speak into what I'm talking about? I think with a lot of those people, when they can expand it outside of just the feeling, there's a
Yeah.
lot of possibility there.
Yeah. That's good. I mean, connected or maybe grounded in value and meaning and purpose and
Mhm.
moral. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Um, let's choose to advocate is next. Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Advocate's next, and they are not the peacemaker. Okay. So the advocate, here's the peacemaker, and they go, well, that's not me. Like I was saying, they are really interested in what's fair, right, and what's just. And so they
Mm,
like to use their voice and communication to speak out about that. Now, oftentimes, an advocate is a person who is either directly or indirectly wounded by someone who didn't say something, and
mm,
so they carry that and they go, "Hey, I'm going to be the voice for myself and others, and so I will say what needs to be said." And I think this makes some great friends for us, because if you've ever
yeah.
been in a group and you're like, "Hey, is anyone going to say something?" You can kind of look at the advocate and they're like, I'm going to say something, and I'm as a harbor, I'm like, that's great. I love that. You
Yeah.
say the thing we're all thinking.
Yeah.
So they're driven by that. Their opportunity for growth is just they don't always have to say the thing, right? I mean, while it is important, I would say not every time do you have to speak out about injustice, not every little
Sure.
injustice. And then also just sometimes what an advocate
Mm,
misses is that they feel like if they don't say something, no one else will. And
hmm.
what's usually true is if they don't say something, someone else will, they'll just take longer to say it. And so sometimes what the advocate
Got it.
misses is that giving someone else a chance actually helps them grow.
Hmm. That's good. mean, I could see I mean, even just, I love that language advocate.
Mhm.
Even with an advocate, it's like, I get this sense that they're trying to sort of protect or accomplish something, right? Yeah, that's kind of what an advocate does.
Mhm.
Um, so maybe as I asked, like with the previous style, with an advocate, um, I think of advocates in my life, and sometimes they can come across strong. Sometimes they can maybe come across overpowering. So what if an advocate is listening? Maybe what's one way that maybe they could remain clear, maybe still stay on point, without consuming or overpowering the relationship.
Yeah. For advocates, I think it's making it about what it's about. So advocates can
Okay.
sometimes get caught up in the injustice of it all. And that makes them very
Sure.
bold and scary. And so what we usually work on is just most people, if you're pointing out that the wrong thing or bad thing is happening, most people will agree with you. It's all the
Yeah.
other stuff in the delivery. So we work on the delivery and kind of keeping it to the point. And then just understanding too that sometimes advocating for someone is not saying something. And that's
Hmm.
often a really interesting idea to them because they feel like,
Sure.
well, no, being an advocate means I have to say something. And it's like, actually, sometimes the best advocates are the ones who, and with great care, they don't speak. They give somebody else
Yeah.
a chance to do it. And so that's
Yeah.
usually a new idea for them.
Yeah. That's good. Okay, so we have P, A, and then we're
Yeah.
on to T,
Yeah,
right?
next is T. So we have the thinker. So
Yeah.
just as it sounds, kind of your traditional thinker style, which is a person who wants to speak about what's precise, what's accurate, what's factual. So, if I'm a thinker and I'm talking to someone and I say, 36% of people do this and it's actually 35, the thinker they're laying awake at night, right? They're like, how could I have
Yeah.
gotten that wrong? That was not exactly correct. And so we need those people. It's
Yeah.
fantastic. Their room for growth, however, is just to lean into the feeling side a little bit.
Hmm.
Being exactly right isn't always the most important thing. There are some conversations where that's not
Right.
so helpful. And then just letting people in on their process. Thinkers tend to go internal when they're
Hmm.
considering what to say next. And while that makes sense for them, it can feel a little bit like abandonment to some of the other styles. And
Yeah.
so even just kind of weighing in and saying, hey, I'm thinking about this. You haven't lost me. I'm still in the conversation. I'm kind of thinking through what to say next.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. As you were sharing that about thinkers, I was in my head thinking about like the vast number of clients that I work with in our clinics at Live Well Behavioral Health, because we are located on the Space Coast of Florida. So like we're just south of Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral and like
Mhm.
all of that industry, and so a huge number of my clients and collectively with our team, we serve engineers, right? And so people who are in that not just figurative space, but they're in like the space kind of industry. And so I sit with people all the time who are thinkers. And one of the things that continues to come up, particularly if they're coming in with their spouse or if it's a family session, or if I've gone to meet with teams, is kind of what you shared. They're internal processors,
Mhm.
and so for the other people, it almost feels as though that maybe they've emotionally abandoned them, like you said, or maybe they're just not emotionally present. So I guess maybe for me, this practical, like how can a thinker remain emotionally present, without really abandoning themselves, right? Because what they need to do is they need to internal process.
Yeah, that is $1 million question.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have $1 million answer, but I'll give you my best
Yeah.
go at it. And I love what you're saying. I get to work with a lot of thinkers too, and I love to work with them because
Yeah.
they are very thoughtful people and they get it right. I think for a lot of those people, what I'm trying to teach them is a language of emotion. So
Mm.
a lot of times it's just not something that comes naturally to them. And so
Yeah.
it can be confusing. And so if you are a person who wants to get things precise and accurate, and then you introduce feelings, that's pretty scary, right? Because that
Right.
feels
Well, and
very
abstract.
abstract. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so it's like, well, I can't put an exact point on this. And so
Yeah.
I'll just not. And
Yeah.
so a lot of our work sort of comes with it's maybe not going to be as exact as you want. However, if you begin to learn that language, you can get pretty close. And what does it
Yeah.
look like to be able to better identify and speak about that?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm hearing in that, and just want to maybe make the inference is that emotion, I guess what we call it EQ or emotional
Mhm.
intelligence, it can be learned.
It can. Yeah, believe it or not, I have not always been the guy I am today. I did not. I was just not born with all the emotional language. So I mean, it's something probably like you, a lot of schooling and being around people has taught me. And so I'm always encouraging in people because I think sometimes they have the attitude of you're born with it or not, and it's like, well, not necessarily. You know, some
Right.
people have an easier time than others, but it's not impossible.
Yeah. It's good. All right. So we're walking through this acronym PAT and then we're on to H, right?
Yeah.
Which is our favorite one.
Our favorite. So it's the harbor, right?
Yeah.
And the harbor is all about creating safe space and depth. And really that tends to look a lot like making space for feelings, for our feelings and others' feelings, and being a container for that. And
Yeah.
it's just important to people like us that when we're communicating, people are being heard, they're being seen, they're being understood. Like that
Yeah.
matters a whole lot, even if we don't agree with it.
Yeah.
Our challenge, however, is it's not always about depth. It's not always about feeling, right? And so I
Uh-huh.
always use the story of being a bad dinner party guest. And so been invited to a dinner party and I was talking to somebody and my friend came over and they said, did you just make that guy cry as he walked away? And I was like, well, I don't think so. And he's like, no, I think he was like tearful. What did you say to him, Jason? And I said, well, I was just asking about his relationship with his mother and what childhood was like. And my
Of
friend's like,
course you did.
you're
Of
banned
course you
from the
did.
dinner
Yeah.
party. He's like, can't you talk about football or something? And I'm like, I don't want to talk about that. And
Yeah.
so those moments are, I mean, they're funny, but what's also true is that you have to know when to use that and when to take a step back.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not everybody is as excited to talk about it as I am.
That's good. Maybe just for sake of clarity, maybe share a little bit of what's the difference between harbor and peacemaker,
Yeah,
because
the
they have some
peacemaker.
similar qualities.
They
Yeah.
do. Yeah, the peacemaker is very selective and they curate sort of what is discussed.
Okay.
Whereas I look at the harbor as kind of saying, hey, bring me all your stuff. We can
Got it.
go there. We can
Yeah.
talk about whatever it is. And the peacemaker more says, I'm willing to go there if it
Hmm.
leads to this outcome.
Got it. Got it. That's helpful. So being a harbor,
Mm.
I'm going to ask this, just for all of us who maybe reap the benefits and struggle with the challenges. So how can a harbor care for others, right, and the key relationships in their life without taking on the responsibility for their emotions, right? Because I think one of the things of harbor is that's the place of empathy, of care, compassion, right? So how do you essentially kind of this idea of how do you care for others with sort of losing yourself in the process, right? Bearing the weight and the burden for others.
Yeah, and that's hard, especially when I think we're talking to someone that maybe doesn't have the ability to communicate about their emotions and things like that. And so we often kind of volunteer and go, well, I'll take that on. I'll
Yep.
carry that for a while. And while there's I think a beautiful thing in that, kind of like the advocate, what we want to understand is that that's not always as helpful as we make it out to be.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes the story we tell ourselves is I'm carrying this for you because you need that, and there's some truth to that, but what's often true as well is if I would teach you to carry it, it'd be easier for you ultimately. And
Sure.
the reason we don't is our own discomfort. And so sometimes I think what harbors need to practice is just having good boundaries about what they carry and how long they carry it for.
That's good. I think we'd do a whole nother episode. Maybe we need to later on boundaries.
Yes, the
That's
B
a
word.
good.
Yes, boundaries are so
That's right.
important and
That's
also
good.
difficult. You know, it's difficult
Yeah.
when you feel like you know the answer and you don't say it.
Yeah.
But yet
Yeah.
that's kind of the I think relational awareness piece you were talking about, or relational intelligence, which is to say that part's about me if I'm doing that. So if it's really
Right.
about the
Right.
other person, maybe I look
Yeah.
at it differently.
Yeah. That's good. In fact, one of the things I think is so important with boundaries is not just boundaries with others, but sometimes it's boundaries with self.
Oh,
To be
who
able to say,
likes that? That is no
I don't
fun.
need to go there. I don't need to own that. I don't need to.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we're finally to the last letter of this PATHS, right? So let's maybe wrap us up with the last
Yeah. So the
style. Yeah.
sparks are fun. They're super fun, right? So the spark is the person who brings the energy, brings the excitement to the room. They're great to have a party with, right?
Hmm.
Whereas you and I might be asking somebody's deepest fears, the spark is
Right.
keeping it going, and
Yeah.
and so we love those people. The challenge for the spark, though, is just sometimes to slow down long enough to talk about the
Yeah.
thing that's maybe not so fun. I have a good friend, and a lot of speakers are sparks, and so he's a
Right.
speaker through and through. And there is a surefire way to get him off the phone. If I'm on the phone with him and I'm saying fun stuff, and it's really
Yeah.
entertaining, and then I go, hey, I'm doing my taxes later. He's done. He's just like, okay, well, I gotta go. I gotta go. Right?
Yeah. Because this
It's
is no
just
longer fun.
yeah, it's just this instantaneous, like I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And so while that makes sense to me, and I love the idea of having fun, I could get better at that myself. What's true is that to be in a relationship with the spark, sometimes that's a struggle because
Right.
sometimes they're the people who just go, "Oh, that's not fun. I don't want to talk about that," and
Yeah.
and that doesn't always feel so great to the people who do.
Yeah. 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 I think for somebody who's on the, I have a good friend. He's a spark. In fact, as you mentioned, many was public speakers, leaders, visionaries, influencers. That they have that quality about them. Um, but one of the things I think I often experience is they're like a whirlwind. They like rush in. They like take up all the oxygen in the room, right? They're big. They're larger than life, right? And then they whirl out, and you're like kind of like, whoa, what just happened? And so I think what you talked about, this idea of like for a spark to be able to slow down long enough,
Hmm.
right, to really to make room for others. Yeah. How if you're a spark, what could you be more attentive to or maybe more intentional about?
Yeah, I think for a spark, what I'm trying to teach them first is just listening.
Mm.
And they're always like, "What's the skill I need to develop? What do I need to learn?" And I'm just like,
Right.
"Oh, it's the thing you don't want to do." And they're like, "What is the thing?" And I'm like, "Just listen." Like
Yeah.
everybody around you is telling you what they need.
Yeah.
I need you to just listen, and that's not to put them down and say they're bad at it, but like you said, if they're moving so fast, they're probably not catching all of what's being said.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if they're not catching all of what's being said, they're not speaking to all of what's being said. And
Yeah.
so the challenge is, can we listen to all of it and then respond?
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. I want to ask a few, maybe just a few practical questions
Yeah.
around this framework, around these styles, and really around the idea of communication as a whole. And again, if we just make this really practical and really kind of relational, I'm curious about what happens in our communication under pressure. So this kind of part of us is, do we tend to communicate the same when we're feeling safe and secure and relaxed? Do we tend to communicate differently, when we're under stress, pressure, or experience conflict? Like, how does that actually work in our lives?
Yeah, what I've seen over and over again, and this has been true with a lot of relationships, is we have our primary, and that's kind of our go-to, but we can develop
Yeah.
skills in each of the others. So it's not impossible to do that, and we often do. But what's interesting is under pressure, we pretty much default back to the primary, right? And
Okay.
so it can
Yeah.
it can give some people whiplash a little bit because they'll go, "Oh, I thought you were way more fun," and it's like, "Oh no, I'm actually an advocate, and this is unfair." And so what happens with the pressure is it just brings us right back to that place we came from. And then
Yeah.
I think, like most things in that place of pressure, whatever the challenges are that we have before, just magnify it, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm a
Right.
spark and I struggle to slow down and now I'm under pressure, I'm going to go faster, not slower.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so we kind of see people get confused because again, we no longer are trying to accommodate the others. We're just being wholly in our primary and all the good and bad that comes with that.
Right. 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 Yeah. When you shared those five different styles, most in my head, kind of just thinking about these almost kind of pairings, where there is the
Mhm.
possibility for pressure, for stress, for conflict. The idea of really misunderstanding, or at least just not being able to, in a moment, be able to maybe have space to, allow the other person to just really to be themselves. And so, like an example, a peacemaker and an advocate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could see where that could create and cause some tension, right?
And
Maybe in
what's
practice,
funny about that is also what a wonderful love story, right? I mean, you work with couples all the
yes,
time. You can
yeah,
hear this couple. They're like, well,
yeah,
they always speak up and they're so kind, and it's always it's
right.
like this is very attractive initially.
There's like opposites attract, yin
Yeah,
and
it's well, this
yang.
is this is
Okay,
so good that they're everything I'm not.
yeah, I
And then
think
you get into conflict and you go, they're everything I'm not. I don't
sure,
know
right.
about this.
I think that's a really helpful perspective. And rather than, I kind of let into it, be like, oh gosh, this could be like blow up and be a disaster. And I appreciate your reframing that to be able to say, and
Mm-hmm.
it's beautiful, right? I mean, I can imagine like a thinker and and a spark, right? The
Mm-hmm.
same kind of, right? Possible tension, but this, two sides of looking at it more holistically is to be able to say, man, there's space for both, and there's,
Yeah.
there's this kind of like we're better together type, idea that I'm hearing you kind of speak to.
Yeah. And here's what's true. I mean, so I'm a Harbor. I married a person who's a thinker. So Jody's a thinker. And
Yeah,
I love that about her. And I would just tell you, I wouldn't be where I'm at today without her being that. And so
yeah,
on our best days, woo, that's amazing. I love it. On days where I don't have a lot of capacity and I just want to talk about how I feel, and she just wants to talk about what's factually true and precise and accurate,
yeah.
not careful, I can make up a story that's not so positive. And
Hmm.
so what I'm always trying to help people to see is like your relationship didn't change. You're still on the same team. You're just hearing it
Yeah,
different.
yeah, yeah. So, sounds like you're practicing something that I think is important to call out, which is the self awareness and the self insight. Like, if you could just give something practical to our listeners to help them, regardless of their style,
Hmm.
right? To increase again what's happening on the inside, so it can benefit in the way that we connect and relate to others on the outside. So, what are maybe some of those practical tools about again the self awareness, the self kind of insight, or the self control, really, right? To be able to have some awareness to be able to respond and connect differently.
Yeah, I'll give you one. I think it's a little dangerous though. So I'm just gonna say you've been warned, but
Okay.
but the thing that I would say is start by asking a person you love, you care about, you cherish, that you spend time with, what it's like to communicate with you. And
Mm,
and be willing to hear the answer, even if it's difficult. One of the
got it.
first things we want to understand is that there's always what we intend. And I think for most of us, we have great intentions, and then there's
Right.
what they
Right.
experience. And so you don't really get good at guessing someone's experience. You just have to ask.
Right.
And so one of the best things to do is just go to that person you care about and want a relationship with and just say, I know what I make up about what it's like to talk to me, but what do you actually experience? And
Sure.
then start to reconcile those two. And if there's a big gap, there's some work to be done.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Last question, then I want to give you some time just to help us better understand how we can stay connected with you and resources that you might have available for our listeners. And so I want to talk about, we some of our examples we've talked about, about couples, families, but these communication styles show up in all relationships, right? So maybe just give a little bit of application how we might be mindful of this or see this play out, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's serving in our local church, whether that is volunteering in our community, right? It's not just a husband and wife, right? It's not just a parent and a child.
Yeah, I love what you said about everything's relational, and that's
Yeah,
true. So I mean, you can kind of sub in anybody into this equation that you have a relationship with. And
yeah,
and I think a good reminder is at the end of the day, we all want to be seen, heard, and understood. And that
right.
doesn't change if you're someone's spouse or kiddo or you're on their team. And so I think if we can remember that, and then remember that what matters most is their experience of us, not our intention. So
Hmm.
I always say when I'm speaking to an audience about this that,
Yeah,
I think I'm a great speaker. So I,
yeah,
I think I'm great. But if everyone in the audience is sleeping while I'm talking, what matters most? And everyone's like, it matters that we're sleeping. And I'm like, but that's communication every day. Right.
Sure.
So you have to learn to kind of see other people for how they see you, and to honor that their way is different. And
Yeah.
what I found is when you can accommodate somebody else's way, they're usually receptive to doing it for you, but someone's got to take the lead.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's really good. I mean, that sense of just because, again, when I go back to what I call the instant story, right? Just because you experience and you put meaning to it, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that's what's happening, right? To slow down, check in with yourself, check in with the other person if you need to, better understand their intentions, better understand. Again, even in this way, like you said, you and Jody, you understand each other's communication style, right? Which gives you more insight in the way that you're able to connect deeper as a couple. And as we mentioned, it's not just for couples. So, okay. So, would love for you to just maybe share a little bit about resources. So, discovering your communication type. In fact, if I remember, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but you have a free communication assessment. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and your website and your clinical work. Like, just tell us a little bit about how we can, stay connected with you or benefit from the work you do.
Yeah. So you can go to my website, jasonvr.com, and there is the free assessment. So you can take that and kind of find out what your type is and then get some more information. And then it also just talks about working with me and some of the different things that I do for teams and couples and all those things. And then if you are a social media person, I'm on Instagram every day with relational tools and tactics and things you can try at jason.vanruler. And so you can start there if you're learning about this and wanting to get better.
That's awesome. Just to all of our listeners, I'm going to make sure that we get those links in the show notes. And so you can find those there. Jason, I am so glad to have you on here. It was really a blessing for me and, a gift to have you in this really a meaningful conversation. So thank you for not just your time today, but your investment in this space. We've talked about this integration of faith and science, this really kind of deeper work in connection and communication. I hear frequently about people who have, like, whether taken the assessment, who have read some of your books and resources, how powerful that has been. So again, I just really appreciate you being with us today.
Oh, I had a phenomenal time. I'm grateful. I admire you, my friend. So thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. All right. To all the listeners, thanks again for joining me. As we continue on, I continue to check out the resources that I have available. I'll post those for you as well in the show notes, and let's keep going deeper by design. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Deeper by Design podcast. If today's episode gave you language, clarity, or a next step, I'd love for you to carry it into a real conversation this week and share it with someone that you want to go deeper with. If you're looking for support beyond the podcast, LiveWell Behavioral Health offers in-person and virtual care in Florida through outpatient therapy and intensive outpatient programs. You can find out more at livewellbehavioralhealth.com. And wherever you live, LiveWell Coaching can help you put these ideas into practice through courses, challenges, and personalized coaching. You can check it out at livewell-coaching.com. So for resources, trainings, updates on the show, and to learn more about my work in Renovi Relational Therapy, you can connect with me personally at trevorhislop.com. All of these links are in the show notes for you today. I'm so glad you're here. Until next time, let's keep going deeper by design.